Welcome to the Classical Comments Podcast, a conversational podcast exploring the ideas, people, and trends in classical education. I'm Rob Jackson, founder of this digital platform, connecting classical school communities nationwide to talent and resources. So today, our guest is a new colleague and friend, Allison Ellis, founder of Mount Titano Media. While her initial career spanned the financial industry and publishing sector, her journey into homeschooling and the classical tradition has now led her to publishing works in support of liberal arts education. Welcome, Allison.
Thank you, Rob.
It's great to have you with us. Your story is so interesting to me. I mean, it really is, because as I have said on this podcast and in other contexts before, I really think that homeschooling is a kind of seedbed for this renewal, this renaissance of classical education. And your story in particular is just fascinating. Why don't you tell our audience how you came to author this new anthology? And I'm going to display it a little later, but I just got to review it, entitled Finding Our Words. This is your new anthology. Tell us how you came to author this particular book.
This one is first in a series, so it is Finding Our Words. This volume, Words That Made America. And the beginning is back at the beginning of my homeschool days. I started reading great American speeches aloud to my daughter. I don't know what drew me to realize that I knew too little about nothing about American history. And so when she was maybe 3, 4, we started singing patriotic songs, memorizing the Pledge of Allegiance, the national anthem, and then reading these speeches. And I realized very quickly, I taught her to read very young. It's something I advocate for. It's not necessary. I don't think children are behind or damaged if they don't start reading at 2 or 3, but she did and loved it. And so that enabled me to start working with more advanced texts with her sooner. And that's not to say that she understood them herself reading them, but I could work with her on pronunciation. I detail how we do this in the book. But we would look up each and every word we didn't know, which was a good chunk of them.
Right, for a toddler.
I didn't know a lot of the words, which is exciting. And I like approaching reading that way. If I don't need my dictionary, I think I haven't learned enough. It wasn't time perfectly spent.
Yeah, right.
But I recognized very quickly that she did understand the meaning. I had to summarize and paraphrase for her, but sooner than later, she knew what the purpose of the speech was, who it was for, the lessons. And now at this point at 14, she could probably help me analyze them.
So in many ways, it was your homeschooling experience introducing these speeches to your very young daughter that just brought you to this understanding that there's something intrinsic to those words. There's something that needs to be shared, and that the quality of these words is something that children respond to. Tell me, what were some of the features in your selection process? How did you even get to those texts that you decided upon?
Well, that was teamwork, but again, it goes back to the early days. I used several different books, and this is more of how the Mount Titano evolved from this. I started using different works, and most of them were very difficult to use with a child. And many of them, either the sequence didn't make any sense, or there was not enough introductory material to immerse the reader in the story and know anything about the speaker to have the speech mean more. And even details like the design of the books. What child will engage happily with a book that's 8.5 by 11, 10-point font, no margins, tight kerning, no leading? It's impossible for young children to read books presented that way, and it's difficult for older eyes as well. And a part of the Mount Titano organizational ethos is parents and extended family and very young children of all ages, reading aloud together.
Yeah.
Together.
I think this is what struck me in your introduction. You decided to homeschool your daughter, and in doing so, felt ill-equipped. and said that you started a graduate program at
Yes.
Stanford, no less,
Yes.
and began to read effectively in great works,
Yes.
much of a tradition that you had not explored before. It was not your education originally. Is that right?
Well, no, actually, I had my undergrad was liberal arts,
Mhm.
literature, but this is all in hindsight. At the time, I thought I had a nice education.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time at Stanford, I thought that was a great master's program. So this a tricky balance to say this the right way.
Sure,
But
sure.
I was grateful to be there. I did learn a lot, and it was a turning point for me. But in hindsight, and I realized they couldn't do anything different because none of us have had the background to give what a master's program in liberal arts should be.
Mm.
And this is the result of almost 2 decades of research and digging into this. But I truly believe that the approach and what I was studying at Stanford could have and should have started in 7th or 8th grade.
Mm.
And that's an overall driving theme as well. It started earlier, before motherhood, traveling the world. I saw all kinds of things that people would probably find hard to believe, of what children are capable of. So, for example, in the Mosquito Coast in Honduras, I was doing some relief work there after a hurricane had destroyed 70% of the country. And not because of that hurricane, just because that's the way they live, these tribes deep in the Mosquito Coast, 3-year-olds carried their infant siblings on their back all day while their mothers worked in the fields and did a very good job of taking care of them.
Hmm.
And I discovered that when I was about 20 feet above the ground, up a very rickety ladder in a hut, interviewing one of the gentlemen living in the tribe. And all of a sudden, a little head popped up on the edge of the floor. And then I saw a little bitty head behind it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And so that's just one example, but maybe even closer to home, not in time, but in space. I took my daughter, Celestine, to Salem, Massachusetts, and we went on a tall ship tour, the Friendship. The original was taken in the War of 1812. It's a beautiful replica.
Mm-hmm.
But in that tour, they explained, and it was new to me, that the crew of those ships could have been as young as 8 or 10 years old.
Hmm.
Captains could possibly be as young as 14 and might even retire in their early 20s, wealthy, if they were good at what they did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So can you imagine anyone talking about sending their 8-year-old to crew a ship?
No, to sea, no.
To Africa?
No.
And so, I mean, that's not necessarily an ideal, but the message is we are absolutely positively asking too little and offering too little to our children.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been that way for so many decades now that the schools have no choice otherwise. And the teachers, this is not pointing fingers because I'm one of them, the teachers don't know any different themselves either because that was their education. We've watered down education and language ad infinitum until now. I like to say it's like Anthony Esselin says, we just talk in sublingual grunts. And with a few real words sprinkled in here and there. And there are exceptions. There are brilliant minds all among us. But it is generally the case that language has been decimated. And I discovered that in looking for textbooks for our homeschool. So I went back to textbooks I used in high school. I went to what was considered a very good Catholic school, and it was. But again, it had already suffered from the hit that had started even, I'd say, 100 years before that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the textbooks they used, they didn't even know what they used anymore. They didn't teach Latin anymore. Mm-hmm. So I kept digging and I searched the world, and I finally found private tutors in England from multi-generational classicist families at Oxford. And they were teaching in a very old traditional way. So that was exactly what we were looking for.
Well, and when you have a living tradition like that, right?
Yes.
Those classicists who have literally for generations passed it down in the family, and the tutorial model is baked in. It's understood. This is who we are. This is how we learn. That's probably about as close as you're going to get to the sources, literally, right? The sources, because they always are embodied, right? This form,
Yes.
this classical tradition is not something that remains merely nice, well-bound volumes on the shelf, like the ones behind you there, but rather something that is lived and experienced. And that's what's so striking to me about the work that you've done. You've taken speeches and provided an introduction, giving a little context. You've actually excerpted the speeches at the tail end to say these would be fine passages to commit to memory. And you've bound the entire thing with the notion that words like these from times past have given shape to our soul as a people. And they have done that well in times past. They can do it again today, as you have experienced.
Yes, and in addition to everything you mentioned that's in the book, I also partnered with Tracy Lee Simmons, the author of Climbing Parnassus, which is, of course, beloved in the classical education world. And he wrote an introductory essay to each and every speech, which does what was missing in all those other books, and which I think it's vital. And everything that Mount Titano publishes will be that same thing. Every book, I want to be layers and layers of learning. Some of them will be implicitly, but also explicitly. So composition is an explicit lesson in these speeches. Oratory. I think ethics and virtue are as well, civics. But even implicitly, there's every speaker is introduced with an image, and I tried to find the image in the finest art available. So a beautiful sculpture, beautiful painting. So multi-layers of learning. We don't have time to learn 10 different subjects one at a time.
Well, and that layering and that selection, that aesthetic comes across. They're actually quite beautiful. I was going to pull up here on our screen a copy of, or rather the visual from your website, and I'll do that in just a moment. But let me ask you one more question before we go there. Because this was such an interesting feature of your experience. Your daughter was involved in a kung fu, a dojo, I assume, studying the martial arts. And I'd really like to know if you see any parallels or any kind of relationship there between the martial arts and the liberal arts, at least as you've discovered them with your daughter.
Well, and myself personally, because I grew up in the martial arts. That's why she was there. And so most definitely. I mean, I'd say historically, if we go way back, the scholar warrior is the ideal leader. And the poet warrior, we even have a few examples in recent history of, we might even call Patton poet warrior, scholar warrior. And that's considered an ideal. But from my own martial art days, I'd say the similarity that most strikes is that after I'd been training just my first, let's say, 6 months, I'd been training 2 a days. I went all in, which is usually my pattern.
Sounds like it.
And I went into class one day, and this was a very intense Korean Chinese blend martial art, very hardcore. And our teacher was throwing me up one side and down the other of the room, and I started crying. And this is as a young adult. And I said, I just don't understand this. I have been working so hard, and it's just not getting any easier. Actually, I feel like I'm going backwards. And I think it's the only time in maybe 15 years that I saw him actually crack up. And he said, "You thought this was going to get easier?" He said, "I've got news for you, and it's good news. It gets harder every single day. And you'll love it. That's the point. Otherwise, you're going backward. You're always striving for the next level," which in hindsight made sense.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's true with any beautiful and worthy pursuit.
Yeah. It was very clear to me, and I'm just going to put these up on the screen. I want to show our audience, those who are viewing the podcast, just the beauty, the quality of the aesthetic that you have chosen, both with the artwork and, as you described a moment ago, the various layers that are encompassed in each and every chapter, whether it's the speeches, and obviously here you have heroines, You also have great texts from the tradition, from the Hellenistic tradition. So anything you want to highlight there in terms of this screen? This is Mount Titano Media.com.
Yes. So you can see there that Finding Our Words, Words That Made America is there. Mm-hmm. And then the third one, Greece and Rome. The Finding Our Words theme is based on my discovery that we have lost our words. And back to the beginning days of homeschooling, when I was looking for those textbooks for my daughter, I finally ended up going to the 19th century for some of our earliest textbooks. And I was, let's say, we'll call it pleasantly surprised that even I learned a lot of vocabulary in those books.
Sure.
And they were meant for 10-year-olds, 8-year-olds. And those children might have grown up on farms. They wouldn't have been what we called worldly necessarily.
Right.
But they would have known their Bible. They might have known Shakespeare, and they could have read those early readers that were used in schools with no trouble. And they also, I actually have a little autograph book right on my shelf right here from a school where it was probably 10-year-olds. And it looks like, the Constitution. It's written so everyone signed off beautifully with some sort of elegant praise of their friend or a poem they had memorized and wrote out. And I thought I'd probably be terrified to look at whatever autograph book came out of a 8th grade or high school now, at least in comparison. And so we've lost our words and we've lost our penmanship and all of the concepts that they represent. If you're not talking about those things, not using those words, it's not in the air we breathe. It's not what we're doing.
Well, a number of our colleagues have commented in this classical sector. We've said we do keep penmanship alive, so teaching cursive. Yes. And in a very practical sense, this makes our students capable of accessing the primary sources, those that were handwritten. So how many graduates of a typical school today who have not taken cursive, have not attended to penmanship, would even be able to read the Declaration of Independence, right, in that beautiful Jeffersonian scroll? So I think there's a very practical question afoot as to whether the loss of such literally handicaps some of our children.
Oh, it stunts their minds, absolutely. It limits their learning. And they're cut off entirely if they can't read the vocabulary and if the diction is foreign, and certainly, and even if it's printed, forget cursive.
That's right.
Forget Spencerian.
Yep, that's right.
Their learning is, if our own language of only 70 or 100 years ago is foreign, that's a nation adrift.
Well, I want to be very clear. Here we are, 15 minutes into our conversation. While you and I can bemoan the terrible state we're in, you are a very hopeful person, as am I, that we're going to turn this around, right?
We are.
And I want to highlight, because I delighted in this myself, seeing that in your text, you've really framed it with practical routines, habits, right, that you've put into practice yourself at home to encounter these great words with real or genuine delight. So maybe you'll give us just a couple more. You've hinted at a couple of them, but what are some of those practical routines, practical habits that you've adopted that have brought these words to life and in a delightful way? We just don't want this to be a couple of curmudgeons bemoaning again the loss of the tradition. We're excited about handing this on to the next generation of 10-year-olds, right? So how do we do that, practically speaking?
I'll tell you a few things I've done with my daughter, and then if you'd like, I can tell you a few things I've done in groups, which I worked with groups at the Kung Fu school. So with my daughter, it started very young, and there is no age too young to start reading aloud with them. Babies just want to hear your voice. They don't understand anything we say. If we say goo goo gaga, they don't know what that means. Right. Or we can recite from the Constitution. Right. So I started reading whatever I was reading. I read aloud with my daughter, and I actually did that when I was pregnant. But so right from the beginning, with the most basic books we would use, we started keeping little rings of index cards, and we would write definitions and use the symbols to help with pronunciation. And we would write the sentence in which we found the word. sometimes the book and even the date, just to make it. And then at the end of class, she would get flower stickers and heart stickers and decorating her cards.
Sure.
We were dealing with 3, 4, 5-year-olds. And we would also do all of that often on our patio, which weather allows almost year round in California. If we're not fleeing fires or earthquakes. And we would have rose tea and maybe fruit or cookies. It would be a fun time. It was never something that either of us looked at begrudgingly. That was what we looked forward to. And then in groups, so this is I think will be interesting for people who are coming to this with a little later start. Either their children have been in school and now they're going to homeschool, or schools are trying new things, meaning old things.
Yeah, that's right.
And
revitalizing old practices. That's right.
One thing I started, so my daughter's Kung Fu teacher at her school, when I was at Stanford, saw me studying all the time. And there were also siblings of students who weren't training, sitting around waiting for their brothers and sisters. So he got the idea, would you like to run an academic class for all these siblings sitting here? And I said, I'd love to, I'll volunteer. And so I started this class that I called Language and Leadership. So we started right at the beginning with how they walked in the door. Oh, no, Billy, you know better than that. You go back out and you walk tall, you walk proud, you smile when you walk in, you nod to your teacher, you greet your classmates. And every class they would come to the front. I didn't force them. And eventually they all did of their own. But they would always, a part of class was coming with a microphone in front of the group and reading aloud or reading poetry, whatever we were reading. And I would have them read the books I was reading at Stanford.
Oh my goodness.
And so it was a little experiment, actually, but it proved very successful. There were children 5 to 16. The biggest group I ever held at one time was 30 or 31. 2 special needs children, one of whom would hide under the desk for the first month or 2 and finally came out and turned out to be a superstar. And a lot of the parents ended up joining. And one of the first things I did, this is a fun approach that can be used in many different ways, but I tried to depower any sort of fear of big words. In the first week of class, the first word we would learn is anti-disestablishmentarianism. and the lesson was big words are nothing but lots of parts of a little word and prefixes and suffixes. So establish, and then we put the pieces together. If you can spell establish, you can spell anti-disestablishmentarianism. And you would not believe, it sounds silly, but they love doing that. And some of my slower students in the beginning, they were the ones at the beginning of class who would want to pop up and spell it as fast as they could. And everybody would clap.
Sure.
It's silly, but it demystifies approaching big vocabulary and thicker texts.
Well, you'd mentioned that on these cards, not only did you highlight the word, but the sentence where you found that word, which reminded me of the notion of a commonplace book. We find a good sentence, a really great or well-constructed sentence, and we want to remember it. Perhaps we even want to commit it to memory, which again, you've done in your book in order to encourage people. Consider this paragraph or this sentence or two, because these are the most sort of the quintessential essence, right, of Douglas or of Lincoln or whomever. I found that very helpful, because effectively you're prompting the reader to consider the commonplace and take them to their own heart, right, to take them to their own memory. So that's a powerful aid. But to the point of delight, as you mentioned, the leader of the dojo, he said to you, "Did you think this was going to get easier?" And you said, I guess it was a rhetorical question, but ultimately he wanted you to see that it is in the difficulty, it's in the striving, it's in the challenge that eventually we come to enjoy. We come to sort of treasure or savor the challenge and take it on afresh. Now, in as much as these words are several registers above most of what we're going to find in a typical classroom around the country, do you find that the difficulty factor using your dojo experience or perhaps other places where your book is being adopted, do you find that the difficulty of these texts is truly off-putting initially, or is there some delight that you're seeing either in your own experience or those of others who are using your work?
There's tremendous delight. And the youngest report back I have is one 10-year-old essentially gushed, telling her mother, "This is how I want to study history." And a woman I had an interview with earlier this week, she is starting it with her 5-year-old, and I hope to hear the same thing. There are a couple of ways to approach it that will help if the student is really feeling, or the parent or the teacher, if it's too much for anybody in the group.
Mm-hmm.
First, there's no time constraint. I've been reading these speeches with my daughter now for 10 years, and we will keep reading them. And surprisingly, I still get chills and I still cry sometimes when I read them. They're that moving, they're that powerful. But also, the speeches are very different. For example, I wouldn't start, if somebody suspects that it might be too much for the child, I wouldn't start with John Quincy Adams. I'd go straight to Reagan. In the very, very early years when it's downloading, it's much easier really to teach the most difficult subjects early, especially language, because it's like ducklings with their mothers. It's imprinting. They just copy. They don't have to understand it fully. That doesn't matter. You're just giving them the words, and they'll have them there to work with, and then the lights will be going on for the next few decades.
Right. That's right.
So it doesn't matter if they don't fully understand it. It's the process and being together and having them be familiar with those sounds. And I think parents will find that sooner than they expect, those children they'll be able to understand more than they think, more than the parents or teachers.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what I took from my review of your volume, that this could work well in a classroom, as you've proven either at the dojo or I'm sure in other classrooms. But perhaps it might best serve as a volume to be used at home by families that are committed to really enforcing this liberal arts tradition, especially if they're in a classical school. And if they're not, that effectively this provides an opportunity, an anthology that gives them access to the tradition in those bite-sized morsels, speeches, and which they can share and savor together, right, around the dinner table, as I think you put it. So I do have to make sure that our audience understands how it was that you went from homeschooling mom and dojo parent to the publisher, the founder of Mount Titano. How did you get there from this idea that this is working? Because that's a lot of effort to actually pull together an entire publishing company for this purpose.
Well, that was my background. So,
right.
So straight out of college.
You knew where to go, right?
Yes. So I'd worked in the financial industry, built and sold companies there, and then started working in publishing for the financial industry that I knew. So it's been my career layering what I do. And was there a particular episode? Was there something
where you just thought, the light bulb went on, as they say, and you thought, okay, we're going to bring this to the general public?
Yes. So it was brewing, though I didn't know it, when I was using all the different materials with her. And with each one, I'd think, this is almost a hit, but it's a fail because of whatever limiting reason. Even if it was as simple as 5-year-olds cannot be expected to be able to track text that tight. If we want our children to read elevated words, we have to make them physically legible,
sure,
pleasant, inviting. And so the little lights were going on left, right, and center. And then reading the speeches, I realized, gosh, there weren't many women in there. And there's a reason, and that doesn't bother me. I understand it. But there were women contributing all through history to the greatness of their nations and the greatness of their families and homes. So that's why we followed, Heroines of History, which was our second release. That was brewing in the back of my mind. These were things I would have wanted to use with my daughter from the beginning.
That's right.
But then it really was during the lockdowns. So for all the years prior to that, nobody, not even family, what I did with my homeschooling. The only thing they asked was, how do I socialize my daughter? And that's, if people haven't been exposed to homeschooling, it's a perfectly innocent, fine question, but
Mm-hmm.
it's also a little ridiculous when people understand homeschooling, that we're with people from 80 to 8 months,
Right.
from 10 or 20 nations, in all kinds of activities every day. It's an immersion into the whole world.
That's right.
But parents went from not understanding, and maybe a little sarcasm when asking how I social. It wasn't always with kindness, but that was from misunderstanding. And then, literally within a year of the lockdowns, my phone would ring, friends would come over, people would grab me in the grocery store. You have your daughter here during the day. You homeschool. How do you do it? People were desperate, really.
Yeah.
It was, I can't imagine being thrown in the deep end like that with high schoolers or seventh graders,
Mm-hmm.
any age. I mean, that would be so hard for families. So from that day on, I kept getting the question, what should we read? What materials are available? What online programs? And I thought, I actually know. I already have ideas of things that could not only be good for the parents or for the school or for the children, but I have ideas that could bring them all to the same page,
Sure.
same books, and they could all love them. Because a lot of materials in school, and they're not all lacking value. There are some nuts and bolts of learning that require sort of dry textbook material. But when we're reading the stories, history, mystery, legend, myth, poetry, it should be beautiful writing, and it should be, if it's not quality and inspiring for adults, the teachers and the parents, it shouldn't be used with the children. It should be uplifting and beautiful. So these books can be used in school, but my main goal was that they could be books that teachers, parents, and students would all be, at least during this time, all on board and love it.
Well, if that's the silver lining to the cloud that was COVID, then thank God, because it's really remarkable. I do want to give you the last word, because we speak to parents, obviously teachers and school leaders as well. But I want to just ask, do you have any advice, right, on how you would recommend getting involved with these texts, especially if they're not yet convinced that their children or their students could really fully grasp these extraordinary words? What advice do you have?
I would say, choose which one is most interesting to you first. So if it's the Words of Greece or Rome, which isn't released yet, but it's coming soon. Mm-hmm. But finding our words that made America, we're coming up on our 250th. This is what I suggest. There are 3 speeches that were made on July 4th in that book, and they are remarkable. They're beautiful. And then there's a Memorial Day speech by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. He opens with, why do we celebrate Memorial Day? Well, for those of us who lived in the battlefields, we know. But for generations to come, what would we tell them? And he says it. Have you read that speech? I hadn't before.
I have, yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's haunting. That's one that makes me cry. Mm-hmm. But I would read that every Memorial Day with my child, or pick the July 4th. Calvin Coolidge's is probably the most accessible. Frederick Douglass's is very moving. So maybe pick a holiday speech. And if the whole speech is too much, go to the memory section. It's broken into little sentences or paragraphs. You can even start with a single sentence and have the child memorize it and talk about it. And then that process is not just improving education. It's a joyful addition to family life and bonding, and it's the making of citizens.
Absolutely. I have to say that in discovering these books and hearing your story, that I was just so encouraged at the thought that we can take words like this and revivify them, and bring them to our children and bring them into our homes in ways that, as you just suggested, would bring real meaning, right, to celebrations that we simply maybe sometimes blandly pass over. Oh, we're going to go to the beach, or we're going to take a hike on Memorial Day. What if we just took one of these texts? What if we took a speech and actually just spent a little time with it in order to see that we are, in fact, the inheritors of a rich vocabulary, of a deep tradition, and something that does give shape to the next generation of Americans. It's a wonderful text. And Allison, I'm just delighted that I got to know you. I'm getting to know you, and that we can promote this work. We're going to encourage others to pick it up as well.
Thank you, Rob. Yes, thank you very much.
Well, join us weekly on the Classical Commons podcast, where you will hear from authors like Allison and others about the renewal of liberal arts education in this country.